Hey guys, welcome back to the hangar deck. I wanted to do the final video, or my final video, on the Allison T56, um, the model that was put out first by Renwall, Revell, and now Atlantis. Um, as in baseball, sometimes in model building you win some, you lose some, and some are rained out. This one was kind of a rain out, and the home team came up short. This model didn't turn out as well as I had hoped. That's my fault. So nothing to do with Atlantis or anybody like that. That's just the way it worked out. But and I thought about not even doing a video, but there was a really important reason why I wanted to do this video. This particular engine, not in this configuration, but this same family of engines, was used in the aircraft that I worked on when I was in the Navy, in the United States Navy. And I was stationed at Moffett Field. For those of you that don't know, that's in Sunnyvale/Mountain View, California. Some of you may be familiar with the NASA Ames Research Center, where we shared runways with that entity. And there were a number of squadrons at Moffett. There was VP-48, which is what I was on. V stands for fixed wing. P stands for patrol. So we were the 48th squadron. So I was in VP-48. There was a VP-19, a VP-46, a VP-47, a VP-50, and there was a reserve squadron, VP-31, and another reserve squadron. Actually, I take that back. VP-31 was the training squadron. VP-91 was the reserve squadron. And then last but certainly not least was VP-9. And that is the subject of what I want to speak about tonight. I want to talk to you a little bit about what can happen when something goes terribly wrong and something goes really right during that time when everything is terribly wrong. VP-9, one of the crews from VP-9, it was I don't remember which crew it was. I'm sorry, I apologize. But it was a crew of 15. Sorry for the dog. And they were out on a mission where they flew close to the Soviet Union in the northern Pacific, off the coast of Adak, Alaska, by about 500 or 600 miles. And they were just probing the Soviet lines. They weren't crossing the they weren't crossing the Soviet border 12 miles off, but they were just coming close, and they were hoping for the Soviets to light off their radar so we could collect signal intelligence, or they could conduct signal intelligence. They were flying the P3, which is this guy right here. And the P3, as you can see, is a 4-engine turboprop aircraft. And as was common, the P3 would loiter one or more engines so that they could stay on station for longer. This particular flight had loitered engine number 1. So engines are counted from left to right as you sit in the pilot's seat. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. So they had this engine shut down, and they had the props feathered, which means the props are turned so that they don't cut any wind. If they don't cut any wind, then they don't spin. That prop will just come to a complete stop and stay there. So they were that way for some length of time. And they started getting into some conditions where the weather was turning, and there was a real danger of getting icing on the prop boots. So if that happened, then the prop might not unfeather, and they might not be able to restart the engine. There was bleed air that was taken off of all the engines, and it was put through the lead edge so that the lead edge stayed de-iced. The lead edge of the horizontal stabilizer was de-iced electrically. At some point in the mission, it was decided that they needed to restart number one to keep that engine from, or keep that prop from icing up. So number one was the logical engine to shut down. 3 of the 4 engines all had alternators. Number one was the only one without an alternator. So it ran a little cleaner than the other engines. And of course, if they had a problem with number one that they had to shut it down permanently, they didn't lose anything electrically. And the P3 could fly on 3 engines just as well as it could fly on 4. In fact, given the right circumstances, it could probably fly on 1. It definitely could fly on 2. So they went to restart number one. So the sequence, and I wasn't a flight engineer, and obviously wasn't a pilot. Actually, as a matter of fact, I was a metalsmith, aircraft structural mechanic. So they went through the startup procedures on number one, which is basically fairly simple. They would unfeather the prop. As they unfeathered the prop, it would begin to spin. It would suck in air into the intake. And once that happened, that air was compressed as it went through the compressor. It went into the ignition area, the burn cans. It was ignited by igniters. And then it went through the turbine, and the turbine spun at a higher and higher speed. That speed was transmitted through this shaft that runs all the way through back to the prop transmission, and the prop was turned. So something happened in the start sequence, and it failed to start. But worse than that, the prop would not unfeather, or the prop would not go back to feather. So it was windmilling. So you had a situation where engine number one was blowing in the breeze. And that causes a couple of problems. One of them is it causes a tremendous amount of drag. When you have a prop that's just spinning and it's not actually pulling its weight, so to speak, you're causing drag on the aircraft. So as this went on, at some point they lost control of prop number one, and it began to overspeed. So the decision was taken to shut number one down with the E-handle. So the flight engineer pulled the E-handle, and there's an E-handle for each and every engine. And when he pulled that E-handle, it attempted to refeather the prop, which did not happen, but it did something far worse. It cut the oil to the transmission for the prop, the gearbox. So that gearbox began to heat up. And at some point, it caused a fire in the engine. So now we have a wing, or we have an engine that's burning. We have a wing full of gas, and we have a long way to go before we can land. So the closest landmass to them was the Soviet Union. That was out of the question. They were not going to land in the Soviet Union. The next closest landmass that was landable, that had someplace for them to land, I believe was 250 miles away. Of course, at this point, they declared an emergency. So once the emergency was declared, and the world became aware, at least in that area, that there was an aircraft in trouble, several things began to happen. There was an RC-135, which was kind of the cousin of the KC-135, that was on a mission, and that mission was called a Cobra Ball. And they were doing something similar to what the P-3 was doing, and that was in surveillance of the Soviet Union. Now you got to remember this was during the Cold War, and we were always ready, on a footing to fight a war if that came to it. So the problem, or the RC-135 was on what was called a alpha mission. It was one alpha mission. It was a #1 mission. As soon as an aircraft reports that they're in trouble, all bets are off. This is not wartime. This is the Cold War, which is not to be confused with wartime. There's an airplane in trouble. We're going to go see if we can help them. So this RC-135 starts hauling you-know-what to the point where this P-3 is at. The P-3 has about 45 minutes before they have to make a decision. And that decision is basically to bail out or to ditch. The seas were very heavy, so bailing out was completely out of the question. It just could not happen because the seas were tremendously high. So ditching was the only real thing they could do. So the next thing they had to do was to notify the world of how many people were on board, what they were wearing, what their location was, where they were headed, what their speed was, and what their intentions were. So they reported the NAVCOM on the P-3. You have a pilot and a co-pilot and a flight engineer right behind him. Over here on this bulk, right behind that, the flight deck bulkhead is the NAVCOM. On this side is the TACO, the tactical commander of the mission. About right here is sensor number 3, and he is the radar operator. Back here, setting sideways, kind of tandem, is sensor 1 and 2, and these guys listen to the sonobuoys to hunt for submarines. Then there was usually an ordnanceman here and an ordnanceman here that acted as observers and onboard ordnancemen. And then there was sometimes an IFT or in-flight technician or an additional flight engineer or second mech. So the NAVCOM is responsible for navigating the aircraft and communicating with the outside world. So the NAVCOM started sending by voice position reports, speed reports, souls on board, what they're wearing. In other words, so many green flight suits, so many orange flight suits. Actually, they were wearing flight suits, but they started getting into their Arctic gear, their waterproof suits, so they could go into the water and hope to survive in that subarctic weather, or subarctic water, or Arctic water. So this NAVCOM was reporting this. Now, if you go on YouTube and you Google this flight, and I'm sorry I didn't tell you this at the beginning, the flight was Alpha Foxtrot 586. You can hear the radio, some of the radio calls that the NAVCOM reported, and some of those radio calls were right before they hit the water. And that guy was such a professional. It was like me talking to you in the voice that I'm using right now. The guy is and was at that time and still is the consummate professional, even though his life hung in the balance. So the pilot was a guy by the name of Jerry Grigsby. And Jerry had been in the Navy long enough that he had actually flown seaplanes. So landing on the water was not an altogether odd thing to him. What is odd, though, and is worth noting, there had never been a successful ditching of a P-3. So that had to be in the back of everybody's mind. So they continued to get as close to land as they could get. They flew and they flew and they flew. They went as far as they could. They were hoping to make it to land, but they knew they weren't going to be able to. That engine, that transmission was chewing itself apart. There was fire coming out of the engine. They used the fire bottle for that engine where there was and I've seen these up in the landing gear nacelles. There were 2 fire bottles, one primary, one auxiliary. The auxiliary could be pumped into that engine or pumped to any of the other engines. They used both fire bottles on that engine, and they used every fire bottle in every other engine to try to put that fire out. And they could kill one leg of the triangle. Fire has to have heat, has to have fuel, and it has to have air. They could take away the heat momentarily with the firefighting equipment, but then it would come back. So that triangle would recreate itself, and you had all kinds of real fuel in the wing. And so if they'd have continued, something bad, even worse than what was about to happen, was going to happen. So about this same time, there was a Coast Guard C-130 that was piloted by Lieutenant J.G. Bill Porter. Now that Coast Guard C-130 had just come back from a long mission. They were doing a humanitarian mission down into the Aleutian Islands. They had just got back to their base, which I believe was Elmendorf. About the time they were landing, the Mayday came out by the P3 of VP9. Those guys refueled and got in the air as fast as possible. Now, I don't know how many hours these guys had already been flying. If I say 8 hours, I don't think that's too much by a lot. But they never thought about that. All they knew was there was a plane in trouble. They were the Coast Guard, and they were going to haul. So they took off on intercept course for where they figured this P3 would go down. Because bear in mind, the NAVCOM was continually reporting their position and how many souls they had on board, what their altitude was, what their speed was. So everybody knew where these guys were going. Finally, they went as far as they felt like they could go. And they turned so that they could land in the water so that they could ditch. And right back here is an observer window. Sorry, right back here. One of the guys that was in one of the observer windows said that when they came down, he remembered looking out the window. The plane was just about to hit the water, and he could not see the top of the wave that was beside the aircraft. That is a big wave. They said that when they hit the first wave, it was fairly smooth, just kind of a skip, but then the second one was really violent. And then I think there was a third. And by the time the plane quit moving, the water was already knee-deep in the cabin. So right up here is an escape hatch for the pilot, co-pilot, flight engineer. That was opened. There are escape hatches over the wings, just like in a commercial aircraft. There was the main cabin door here. I'm not sure if it was opened. But I know these two, that certainly this one was opened, and the escape hatch up above was opened. They got 2 of the life rafts out. Unfortunately, the bigger of the two, the 12-man raft, got away from the aircraft, and they never could get close to it. So the smaller raft that had about enough room for, I believe it was 6 men, had to hold everybody that was on that plane that got off. One of the guys that was back in the tail never got out of the plane. We don't know what happened, whether he was knocked unconscious, whether he died in the impact, we don't know. The pilot, Lieutenant Commander Grigsby, got on top of the plane, whether he was thinking I'll be the last man off or what, but he started walking top of the plane. He slid off onto the wing and he went out into the water, but he was far enough from the raft he could not get to the raft. 3 guys got out of the raft, 3 enlisted men got out of the raft and tried to reach him, but it was futile. You have to remember the waves were violent. They were horribly violent. And they could not get to Lieutenant Commander Jerry Grigsby. The last they saw of him, he was disappearing as he drifted further and further away from the plane. So they got in the rafts, and they looked around at each other, and they did a head count, and they realized that they were missing 2 men. They were missing Harold Butch Miller. He was an AE2, which electronic aviation electrician, 2nd class. He was the one that never got out of the plane. And of course, they were missing Lieutenant Commander Jerry Grigsby. So then they started the effort to survive. The water was exceedingly cold. Obviously, it wasn't frozen, but it was very, very cold. Probably in the low 40s, if not colder. They were in their exposure suits, but 3 of the guys had gotten wet trying to get to Lieutenant Commander Grigsby. They were holding on to each other, trying to survive. I neglected to mention at the beginning of this little talk about a fantastic book that I think you should pick up. You can get it on Amazon. It's called it's called ADAC, The Rescue of Alpha Foxtrot 586. It is a fantastic book. It is well written. It was written by a skipper of one of the other VP squadrons at Moffett. The guy knows which end of the tube the round comes out, and he did a masterful job. Also, if you go on YouTube and do some searches, you can see some interviews with the guys that were on the plane at a 10-year reunion, and you can also see an interview from the guy that picked them up in his fishing boat, and I'm going to tell you about that in just a second because it's going to surprise you. Or maybe it won't. I don't know. So these guys were in the raft, and after they'd been in the raft sometime, hour or so, they hear the first airplane overhead, and that's the RC-135. Now, the RC-135 is built to fly high and lean, but this thing was coming in low to try to spot these rafts and see these guys. They wanted these guys in the raft to see them up there, to let them know that there was somebody that cared about them, that knew where they were. And that's what they did. These are Air Force guys coming to the rescue of some Navy guys. And they flew down low, and they were looking for this raft, and they saw the raft. And, you know, you can say what you want about the rivalries between the services. And they squabble amongst each other. You know, the Navy's the best. No, the Marines are the best. No, the Army's the best. No, the Air Force is the best. No, the Coast Guard's the best. And they fight and squabble among themselves. But if one of them is in trouble, you can count on the fact that all of them, if they're within earshot, are going to drop what they're doing and come help them. And that's just exactly what these guys were doing. So sometime after the RC-135 came on the scene, the C-130, the Coast Guard C-130 that had already been on a long flight, finally made it over to the P-3. Now, the C-130 and the P-3 were brethren in that they both had the Allison T-56. So they had like engines, except on the C-130, the prop box was configured like this one, so it hung low, where the P-3, it was twisted the other way, so it was more up rather than low. That C-130 flew over, and they started dropping flares to say, hey guys, we know where you're at, plus we can see you now. Even though it's getting dark, or it is dark, we can see you. Then the RC-135 starts flying out, trying to find ships, trying to find anybody. You know, we don't have a plane at this point now in this day and age that can land on the water to get these guys, so we got to go find a ship. And so they go and they find a ship that is answering the distress call. It's a ship that's been at sea for 6 or 8 months. It's a working ship. It's a ship where the men work day and night catching fish, and then cleaning those fish and icing them down, putting them in coolers until they can go back and deliver these fish. These men were Soviet sailors. They were Russian sailors. Now they weren't in the military, but they were still Soviets. And the Americans and the Soviets, even though we'd been allies in World War II, we distrusted each other. We didn't trust each other. But these guys were on their way home. They turned their ship around. There was an international law of the sea. When a sailor is in trouble, you do everything you can, up into including reasonably risking your own life to try to save that sailor. They turned around and they hightailed it as fast as they could, which wasn't fast because remember, the seas are really rough. But they hightailed it to try to help these sailors. Finally, they get close, but it's getting really rough inside the rafts. 2 of the 3 sailors that had gotten out of the water to try to save their beloved pilot were getting close to not making it. They were so cold, all of them were so cold, that it was beginning to become hard to speak. They were so cold that it would hurt. Some of the guys said that they wanted to just close their eyes, but they knew that if they closed their eyes, they were going to die. They fought to stay awake. They fought through the pain. They were in horrible pain. They were so cold. I don't know if you've ever been even close to being that cold, but they were ever so cold. They fought through that pain. And finally, one of the guys said they saw off in the distance a light. And he said he thought for a minute that he was hallucinating. And maybe it was just a star. But then the light began to change position and grow closer. Finally, the Soviet fishing vessel gets close enough, and I keep repeating that, but it was incredible for 1979. Finally, this Soviet fishing vessel gets close enough that it lowers a whale boat to go over and pick these guys up. Now they realized that these were Soviets that were coming to get them. They realized that they might be taken to Russia and never heard from again. I mean, it's a possibility. These sailors get on the raft, 1 or 2 of them, and they start physically throwing these guys into the whale boat. They had to throw them into the whale boat because they basically represented dead weight. And speaking of dead weight, one of the sailors that had gotten into the water had already expired. The other one expired with the Soviet fishing vessel in sight. One of the gentlemen said they grabbed me, they threw me into the boat. One of the sailors grabbed me by the lapel, picked me up, said he was a big guy, said he was huge. And he picked me up and he threw me into the bow of the boat. And he thought, man, they're starting the interrogation already. And then he said he saw him do something that was just incredible. He said, I'll never forget it. He unzipped his jacket, he took his own jacket off, and he covered me up to try to start to warm me up. Finally, they get everybody on the boat. They head back to the ship. They get to the ship. They get these guys up onto the ship. One of the officers said they came in, they set them down in the galley. They stripped their clothes off. They got them wrapped in blankets. They gave them hot tea. And then they gave them more hot tea. And then they gave them some more hot tea with some bread with either jelly or butter and cheese on it to start getting their blood sugar up. After another round of hot tea, they got them up and they put them into showers that were warm, and then they gradually heated it up, which is exactly how you bring somebody back that is near irreversible hyperthermia. So they get these guys back and they put them into a room, and there's a few magazines, or they put them into a bunk, and they tell them, get some sleep. Well, their closest landmass is at home, so they start heading for a closed city in Russia, a place where no American has ever been. And they get to this dock, and this is where the Russian submarines, this is where the Soviet submarines come out, and this is what the P-3 does. The P-3 tracks submarines and Russian surface ships. So these guys are like in the home hive of Russian-Soviet submarine activity. Of course, there's some Soviets there to meet them. They take them to a building. They put them in a room. So there's some magazines there. They happen to be English-speaking or magazines written in English. And it was a few days before they were strong enough to travel. They asked them some questions. They asked them their names. And these guys said, we told them our names. We told them our birth dates, and we told them our social security numbers. That's all we were supposed to say. And after they'd asked them a couple of questions and they realized that's all they were going to get, they just basically said, no biggie. So within a day or two, another unprecedented event happened in that a United States Air Force C-141 landed at a Soviet base, and these young men were put on this plane and they were flown home. Flown back to Elmendorf, and then eventually they made it back to Adak and then Moffett. It was an incredible time. It was a time in 1979 at the height of the Cold War. It was a time when we were 30 minutes, a missile's flight time to hell from ending the war, or ending the world. It was a time when one adversary and a weapon of war had trouble, and our adversary came to the rescue. You think, maybe nobody else does, but I used to think when I was a kid, what if there was some sort of worldwide disaster, back during the Cold War, and the Americans and the Soviets had to work together to save the world. Maybe we could see things a little bit differently. That's what happened at that point in time. There was a Soviet sailor that realized it was more important to save those guys than anything else. They were sailors at sea that were in trouble, and that's all that counted. There were 5 men that were lost on that P-3, and I don't want to end this very poor video without mentioning those 5 sailors. They were my shipmates by virtue of the fact that I was in the Navy. They were in my sister squadron at the time, and their names are AW, Aviation Warfare Airman Richard Garcia, Aviation Warfare Airman Randy Rodriguez, Aviation Warfare 3rd Class James Bruner, Aviation Electrician 2nd Class Harold Butch Miller, and finally, Lieutenant Commander Jerry Grigsby. Those 5 young men, those 5 men that will forever be young, paid the ultimate price. And there were more men, American men and Russian men, that were willing to pay the ultimate price to see that the other 10 men survived. It was a different time in a very different time. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I know it's not good enough to really do justice to these 5 men that gave it all, and to the men that came to their rescue. But it was something that I thought a lot about while I was building this model right here. Hadn't thought about it for a long time. So that's it from the hangar deck. I hope you all have a great evening. And this Memorial Day, maybe you'll have 5 other names to think about. Thank you very much.